Hello and good morning. Welcome back to everybody. We've had a jolly good discussion on Brexit, but now we're going to talk about the tea charge with me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, standing in for the great James O'Brien, who's having a well-deserved holiday. The question here, really, is that there was a great campaign to persuade people to buy diesel cars, that it was the government here, the then Labour government, it was the European Union, it was the motor manufacturers. They were all pushing diesel. That's what everybody had to buy to be environmentally friendly. They were concerned that petrol churned out carbon dioxide and ignored the fact that diesel was churning out nitrous oxides and particulates. And now here we are in a position where the air quality in London is really bad. It's figures come out saying that thousands of people die earlier than they otherwise would because of the poor air quality. And so the response of the bureaucracy, which it seems to me has created a good deal of this problem, is to punish the motorist further, and particularly the poorest motorists with the oldest cars, and that they're going to be hit, as of today, by this T charge, which is an extra £10 on top of the congestion charge of £11.50. So £21.50 to enter central London if you're in an old car that you may have been encouraged to buy by the government and by EU policy. And is that really fair? Or are there other problems? Shouldn't we have a tax on Transport for London for gumming up all our roads and making it impossible to go along the embankment nowadays, or for closing Bank Junction? The constant effort to make moving in London more difficult, the narrowing of pavements, the sequencing of lights so they seem to be red more than they were in the past. They're inevitably red more than they were green, because otherwise traffic would keep on crashing, and we don't want that. But the question I'm hoping people will call in on is whether this is the right answer or whether other things should be done. I heard Nick Ferrari earlier saying that we should be looking at the heavily polluting buses and whether that isn't something that should be attended to. But it seems to me that this is one of those instances where the politicians and the bureaucrats have created the problem, and now they're punishing the motorist, the British voter, for problems of their making. And this doesn't seem to me to meet the measure of fairness. As it happens, I think it's one of the great scandals of the modern time that the setup to encourage diesels was based on an obsession that petrol engines were putting out carbon dioxide, a failure to consider what the risks of diesel engines were, a cabal with the producers who then fiddled the tests to get it through. And we know all this. This isn't speculative. We know that Volkswagen fiddled the tests and were only caught when the Americans discovered what was going wrong. But the EU, the British government and the motor manufacturers were all in it together. And it doesn't seem to me right that it's the British motorist who should then be penalised, and that the effort should instead be to increase the supply, whereas what the Transport for London has been doing is to reduce the supply. And demand is growing, and there may be reasons to try to control the demand as well, but that actually reducing the supply of road space in London, when still most people want to drive around in their cars, seems to me the utmost folly, and is making congestion worse, because one of the worst things for air quality is when there's heavy congestion. So it's almost a self-inflicted wound for which then the British motorist is punished. So I wonder if we're going to get some callers coming in on this on 0345 6060 973 or text on 84850. And I'm very pleased to say that I can welcome Mark, who's calling from the City Airport. Mark, what would you like to say?
Yeah, good morning, Mr. Rees-Mogg. Yeah, a lot of what you've just, what I was going to say, you've touched on. Driving through London, it's one of the busiest cities in the world. We're getting bigger and bigger. More people are driving in London, and it makes no sense. I'm sure nobody can agree that it makes sense to restrict the roads in London. As you said, you've touched on things like cycle lanes, and whilst I understand having people on cycles is a noble cause, and it makes us healthier, and it's obesity and all that sort of stuff, and less travel in vehicles. You're creating the problem by slowing all the traffic down. Certain boroughs are 20 miles an hour, as well as speed humps every 50 yards. You're making cars speed up and slow down. The Bank Junction is another one, which is it's forcing traffic all the way in smaller and smaller roads and it is bureaucracy, and I'm sure the Bank Junction experiment will be a massive success.
Well, they'll say it is, won't they? Because they've decided that before they started.
But of course it will, because there's less vehicles there. There'll be a markedly a decrease in the amount of accidents, and the air quality in that particular area will go down. It will be a massive success. But in the meantime, all the roads round it are completely congested. I mean, the embankment is an absolute nightmare. Coming eastbound, it is 20 hours a day. It's congested.
Absolutely. The embankment, which was one of the great arterial routes in London, is now impossible, and it makes getting into the City of London for people who want to do business really difficult. I
totally agree, and getting to your place of work.
Well, Parliament Square is dreadful.
It is. It's one lane, and you sit in that traffic, turn right onto the Parliament Square, and you've got pavements that are 20 feet wide. Then you've got the cycle lane. Then you've got the buses. Then you've got more pavements, and then all the traffic is squeezed onto one lane. It makes no sense to me at all.
And this is all decided by Transport for London, who've completely mucked it up, and then they punish the motorist for causing congestion that actually they've caused. It's deliberate policy, isn't it? It's a hostility to the motorist and to some extent to the taxi trade.
It's trying to force something that is going to happen, and vehicles, the motor manufacturers are starting to cotton on that people want to drive electric vehicles, and it will happen. We will become more electric, and the vehicles will become cleaner over a period of time. But it looks good for a politician, maybe the Mayor of London, to say, "Look, I've made a difference. I've made something happen here, and can I please stay another 4 years?"
Yeah, but they've made a difference by making the lives of all motorists worse, which doesn't seem to me a very positive slogan when going into an election.
No. But if the air quality does go down, then they'll say, they'll spin it round and say we've got so many dirty vehicles.
Thank you very much. Now we've got a wonderful call coming in from a beefeater from the Tower of London. Good morning. Is that Spike?
It is, yeah. Good morning, Mr. Rees-Mogg.
Well, what an honour that you should call. I'm a great admirer of beefeaters and the wonderful history of the Tower of London. So delighted that you're on the line.
Many thanks. The point I wanted to make is that I was surprised to find out that I've got a 1.8 petrol Golf, as many of the Yeoman warders here in the Tower of London. We have to live here in the Tower of London, and so we've all got our own car parking spaces. We live here with our families, and my car's a 1993, and then I received a letter saying that I'll also be subjected to this, unfair tax. We already pay the congestion charge, and now we're paying this, if you've got an older car. I mean, we're all veterans. We're not wealthy people driving around in new cars, and it was a little bit surprising to find this as well. So, and people saying, "Oh, you shouldn't bring your cars into London." Well, people that live here, because of their positions, then it seems to be affecting us as well.
You don't have any choice. You've got to live there. It's
exactly right. Yeah,
part of the condition, and therefore you're being penalised. And you've done a lifetime of public service.
Yep, 35 years actually. 35 years in the Royal Air Force. So.
Yeah. So at the Tower of London, what are your responsibilities?
We're custodians of the Tower. Have been since 1483. So, 37 of us live here.
Well, I was given a wonderful tour of the Tower of London earlier this year when I went round with one of my sons, and we went to see Thomas More's cell.
Yes, you did. I saw the photographs of one of my colleagues posted, it was when you were here. So.
It was a wonderful thing and a real privilege. And you're keeping a watch out for the next Colonel Blood, aren't you, to make sure nobody tries to get away with the crown jewels?
We certainly are. 1671 was the last attempt, so I think we've got a good record.
You've got an excellent record. Well, thank you for your public service and for calling in and for making such an important point that this is hitting people who are doing good work for the country and are on modest incomes and really have no choice but to have their car in London. It just isn't fair. Thank you very much for calling, sir. Now I've got Alex from Loughborough. Good morning. You want to talk about taxes and environmental issues?
Hi, Jacob. Yes, honoured to speak to you. It's nice to have someone polite and honest between 10 and 1. It seems to me that every time they bring in a new environmental or change to the tax laws with regards to cars, that it gets more and more aggressive. So if you, when they changed it previously from being based on engine size to being based on the CO2 emissions, older cars, it didn't apply to. So if you are of a modest income and can only afford a car that was registered, I think it's pre-2007, you have no choice but to pay rather a large amount of tax, even if your car doesn't produce much CO2. So it seems to me that every time they do this kind of step, it becomes regressive, and it punishes those on low incomes who can't afford to buy the new cars.
That's absolutely right, and it's really interesting, isn't it? It's a socialist who brings in a regressive tax that hits the poor most of all.
Exactly. I mean, I'm on a modest income. I drive a car that was registered in 2005. It is a diesel. I don't live in London, so I don't have to deal with the new tax. But I pay, I think, £160 a year. If you bought a new Golf, exactly the same specifications, roughly the same output of CO2 and pollutants, you would pay a dramatically lower
fee.
Yeah,
it's just generally not fair. Thank you so much. It's now 11:15, and this is Jacob Rees-Mogg standing in for James O'Brien. Hello, good morning. This is Jacob Rees-Mogg, and we've been discussing the T charge. We're going to go on a bit later to talk about Boris Johnson's great speech, and after that I hope we're going to get on to policemen painting their fingernails and whether we think that is a good idea. But that's all up in store for us later. In the meanwhile, it's the T charge and whether this is punishing motorists because of mistakes made by the bureaucrats. And I've got a call coming in from Rajid in Harrow. Good morning, Rajid.
Good morning, Mr. Rees-Mogg. The point I want to make is that yes, people on a lower income like myself will be very will be hard. I'll be hard hit by this tax. But let me try to explain a few points, particularly about the advantages of diesel engines as well. Now, I'm going to be forced to be buying a new car after having this for about 20 years, and it's still running very, very strong. And the cost of making a new, the production of a new car produces huge amounts of pollution. So I effectively being forced to basically be ultra consumerist and buy something new.
Mm-hmm.
We're all being forced to buy something new, and for the moment I'll be able to survive because the T charge applies only in the hours of the congestion charge, and I never went to London during the congestion charge hours anyway. But when the ULEZ scheme comes in 2019, as has been proposed, then nobody with an old car can drive into the North Circular Road area or the South Circular Road area without having to pay 24/7. So that means that I'll probably have to I'll be forced to get a new car, spending thousands of pounds that I can't afford, or I'll have to give up my car, which is something I'm seriously considering.
And what is your business?
Well, I work in a university, and sometimes in the evenings I've got to carry things like flower pots and things like that students are dealing with for botany.
Mm-hmm. And so you need your car for your work?
Yes, I do need my car for setting up certain practicals where you have to take up heavy equipment into London. Now, I think that, you see, the government did, I believe, sensibly encourage diesel because it's producing very low carbon dioxide. And the advantages of the diesel engine is that it can actually take a range of fuels apart from diesel. For example, biodiesel. And they did used to encourage biodiesel, but now there's absolutely no support for biodiesel, and the biodiesel industry is completely going down. And biodiesel uses waste cooking oil. So why didn't they encourage biodiesel further and maintain that incentive to use waste cooking oil? So
I think because there wasn't enough waste cooking oil, and that therefore they were growing plants to create the biodiesel, and this was thought to be pushing up the price of food.
They can still have some diesel vehicles running on waste cooking oil. I think it's still possible for certain sorts of vehicles, but they're basically demonizing diesel far too much when the diesel engine is actually a very efficient engine.
As long as it's not poisoning us, which is obviously the reason that it's under attack.
Alternatives. But anyway, I think that this is very unfair. I mean, they should have done at least a couple of more things. They should firstly either give us some money to buy a new car. Alternatively, they should think about possibly encouraging biodiesel. Alternatively, they should not be taxing people who had these cars in the first place, and they should only penalize people who are buying a new car and say, thou shalt only buy the kind of car that we specify. And finally, they should improve public transport, which is really not up to scratch.
Thank you very much. Those are all very good points. And Christine's got a very interesting point to make. Christine's calling in from Ramsgate and is going to tell us about the problem with the trees. Christine.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Yes, I'd like to look at this from another viewpoint. Everybody knows, I think, that trees help air quality because they cut down on pollution. Well, recently, last month, we had 70 horse chestnut trees, over 100 years old, chopped down on Tooting Common by Wandsworth Council, despite loads of protests going on to try and stop it, because apparently they found that a couple of them were likely to be diseased, but people were saying, well, that's no reason to cut all of them down, but Wandsworth Council decided in the end to cut all of them down, and they're going to plant up little saplings, which everybody knows will take decades to grow to the same height and, ability to cut pollution as the mature horse chestnut trees. And also, at the end of our road, a magnificent sycamore tree was recently chopped down in order to build a block of flats, when everybody wanted to keep that area as a little space for people to enjoy and keep the sycamore tree.
It's very sad about the horse chestnuts, isn't it? They've got that moth that has been attacking them and bringing disease to them. But I read last year that if you carefully gathered up the leaves and burnt them when they'd fallen off, you would find that you got most of the moths for the next year. And I know somebody who tried this and it worked extremely well. So it may have been they didn't need to cut down the trees.
Well, exactly. That's what people are saying. And when I found on the net that Mayor Sadiq Khan has got an initiative now to make London a garden city, it makes me laugh. When at the same time all these trees are being chopped down.
Yes, well, thank you very much for raising that point, because I think it's a really good one, and trees are the lungs of London, to slightly misquote something that was said on the royal parks, actually, at the beginning of the 18th century, were defined as the lungs of London, but I think that's mainly because of the trees. So thank you, Christine. And now, Steve from Chelsea, good morning. You want to have a go on the congestion charge?
Yeah, can I remind you, first of all, that it was one of your colleagues, Boris Johnson, that brought in the chaos that is currently London and the congestion charge.
Wait, he didn't bring in the congestion charge, though, did he? That was brought in by Ken Livingstone.
He didn't bring in the congestion charge, but he brought in the cycle.
Yeah. I think he's guilty as charged for the cycle lanes.
Well, no, you don't get charged for that. But the problem is it is they that are the culprit for slowing down London's traffic. In many areas, they were ill thought out, rushed through. He was desperate to get them through before the end of his mayoralship, and that is one of the reasons why we are suffering the problems that we now suffer. The other reason is that he chose to increase the number of private hire on the road, so we have less road space and more vehicles on the road, driving continuously around, sort of plying for hire. But the emissions from diesel engines is only a small part of London's problem. The majority of pollution is actually 70% from your metal particulates, brakes, tyres, composite things that go into cars and come out of their engines. So that is the majority of pollutants. The diesel is actually a small part, and quite a large part of the diesel emissions comes from refrigerations, from lorries and such like.
So you're saying that diesel is the fall guy, and that therefore this T-charge is unfair because it's hitting the wrong thing?
Well, it's unfair in that the amount of vehicles that are of that age that are likely to be charged is the minority, and they get, hopefully, well, I'm sure the mayor is hoping that they be replaced with more modern, sort of more efficient hybrid engines, which have already racked up a huge amount of carbon points, as it were, through travelling from one country to another before they finally end up in this country and put onto our roads. Rather than take an old car off the road, which doesn't do that much mileage, we're being told to invest in vehicles that have already produced significant amounts of carbon, I can't think of the name of it, but in order to get them here. But what I would like to say, one of the solutions, I think, is actually to make the buses free, or have a nominal charge on a bus just to cover the running costs.
But who pays for that? Because nothing is free. You'd have to increase taxes somewhere to get the money for it, or increase the council tax or business rates. Where would you like to put the charge?
Well, we already subsidise the buses. They're already subsidised by the taxpayer. We could have, say, a nominal £1 charge or something.
But that would then be a bigger subsidy, wouldn't it? And it's a question of how do you pay for that?
Well, the business already suffers from congestion in London, and it already suffers, and we're constantly told every time there's a strike or roadworks or whatever, that business is costing business millions. So we'd be looking overall to people within the congestion charge to help contribute towards that. But we, like I say, we already subsidise private transport. We subsidise the buses, we subsidise the trains, and they will continue to be subsidised even if they become automated, because it costs a lot of money to run that infrastructure. So why not just say, look, we're going to get, say, a bus takes 75 people. We can put 75 people in a bus. We can only get 5 in a car. 3 cars take up the space of 1 bus. It seems ridiculous that we are putting more cars on the road to carry what could go on buses.
Well, thank you very much. That's a very interesting point. I do think it's difficult to pay for, but I think you're making a strong argument. I'm much looking forward to having a word with a London taxi driver shortly, because as Disraeli said, they are the gondolas of London and are so important to making the city work and providing a safe and secure means of getting about. The Hackney carriage, as it used to be called, is absolutely the finest way of travelling in London. So that's what we're going to keep in store for you. But currently, this, in case you hadn't worked out, is Jacob Rees-Mogg. I'm standing in for James O'Brien on LBC. The time is just coming up to 10:30. Well, welcome back, and thank you for listening to those messages. As this is a good commercial station, we don't get funded by the state and the taxpayer. So listen and please do what they say, because that's what's needed. Anyway, back to the calls. We've got a taxi driver who wants to talk to us about the T-charge, this new charge that is being imposed on motorists with slightly older cars. And we're asking if voters are being punished for government failures on tackling pollution. So Jim from Wandsworth, over to you.
Good morning, Jacob.
Good morning.
On the T-charge, I think everybody would welcome cleaner air in London. However, it's a sledgehammer to crack a nut, and I don't think they're going to crack the nut. With the congestion in London, it's not going to go away, because every time maybe people say, I'm not driving into London today, another cycle lane opens, or there is narrowing of the junctions. You've only got to look out your window at the Houses of Parliament, look south over Westminster Bridge and see what's going on there. It's chaos, Jacob. You know it. I don't have to tell you.
No, I know. I try and get into Parliament, and Parliament Square is jammed practically every day. And it never used to be. It's the cycle lanes that have gummed it up.
The embankment. But what I would call to phone is that from January 1st, 2018, all new taxis coming online for drivers have got to be electric. Now, that all sounds very good, and sure, that everybody will want it, cleaner air. But the cost is so prohibitive. It's £68,000 with a small scrappage charge. Now, that is prohibitive when our competitors can buy at £23,000. That's their lowest figure. And they've got the choice of 26 vehicles at the moment. We have the choice of 1. And the traffic congestion will not be there if they would sort out stopping the junctions being narrowed.
Yes, that must be right, because so many junctions have been narrowed, and therefore the capacity is reduced. And you see this the whole time across London.
Well, you do, and the problem is, if you look at anywhere where this traffic congestion is, cars are stationary, they're belching out the fumes, and it's all really well to say, well, if they were all electric, they wouldn't do it. But the other question is, what happens to these batteries when they come to their end of 3-4 year life cycle? What do they do with those?
Well,
somewhere.
It's a very good question, because I used to drive a hybrid car, and eventually the battery just collapsed, and then the car wouldn't move an inch. So you get a car that's completely useless once the battery part of it goes.
Yeah. The other point, Jacob, is you go around anywhere in the West End. I don't know about just outside the West End, but the West End, Kensington, Chelsea, Hackney, Wandsworth, where I live, charging points, they're virtually zero. You might see the odd 3 or 4 opening up, but they've brought this charge in for everybody, but they haven't put anything else in place. Or someone may have an electric car and say, well, I can't go into London, I can't charge it.
Absolutely. And if you run out of charge, you're broken down and you're blocking the traffic.
And what happens then? More charges involved. Go away, truck.
Yeah, well, indeed. I'm not sure these things have been thought through, and it does seem to me that regulation between proper taxi drivers and everybody else should be equal, that it's very unfair that you're so heavily regulated and the rest of the licensed hire trade can get away, as far as one can tell, with anything. But thank you very much. I'm a great supporter and believer in the London cab trade. I think you're an advertisement for this city, and your knowledge of where to go in London, the knowledge, is one of the prides of our city. So thank you very much. Ross from Millwall, good morning. You want to tell us about road pricing?
Sure. I'll start with a note of agreement that I agree with you about black cab drivers, and that they're getting a very raw deal in comparison with the sort of disruptive competition coming in. But
thank you. But I know you want to disagree, so let's get on to the meat of it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
So, how did you feel about when Boris Johnson, in his sort of short-term populist move, was elected on scrapping the Western congestion charge zone?
Oh, I thought that was sensible.
So you didn't see road pricing in a place like London as the only practical way forward of really managing a very complex, problem going forward.
Would you go for the
change over time, and if you put a price on it,
are you suggesting
adapted?
A Singapore model where the pricing changes during the course of the day, depending on sensors
during the course of the day, or as new things are discovered, like scandals to do with diesels? I mean, and every day traffic's bad, but that's been exaggerated. It's not impossible, but congestion charging rates need to go up. They need to extend it north, south, east and west and manage it in a smart way, which is a lot more possible than it used to be.
I think road pricing may be a long-term solution. I think the difficulty is motorists...
Long-term. That's what I'm thinking about.
But I'll tell you why...
You're having a fun chat with the cabbies and the van drivers and whatever in a very sort of short-term, knockabout. I'm talking about long-term, opposite of what Boris was doing.
But the point I'd like to raise is that currently motorists pay very heavily through petrol impositions and diesel impositions, and also on the annual charges.
It doesn't go any way to cover the real costs of the finite resource they're using.
I think that's difficult to argue. It's a huge money maker for the government. But I think you have to. It would be unfair to charge motorists twice, to add road pricing on top of fuel duties and car taxes.
It's tough, but it's still not enough. It's for the reality of where we need to go, it's not enough.
Okay. Well, I don't think we're going to agree on that, but thank you for calling in, and I think road pricing is a serious point that needs further discussion. But we're now going to move to Ulster, to Alex in Londonderry. So what would you like to say, sir?
Good morning. I'm harping back to the pollution problem we were talking about earlier, as opposed to the road tax. Well, it's part of it, really, isn't it? Look, some years ago, I remember that we were all told that the petrol cars were terribly, heavily pollutant. We must change to diesel. Now it's the other way, and diesel was made cheaper, of course, but now it's equal in price, I think. What was the theory in that? Have they got it right this time, I'm wondering?
Well, that's a very good question. They thought they knew what they were doing a few years ago when they told us we should all go for diesel, and then they discovered that they'd bungled it.
Well, exactly. It makes you think and hope that they get it right this time round, considering the expense that's involved. I'm paying over £500 a year for my tax, and they want me to take the car off the road. Well, what's the government going to do if all of us who are paying that sort of money for our yearly tax? It's going to make the budget's going to be a bit changed, isn't it?
Well, the more tax on people distorts the markets in other ways. They have less money to spend on other things. Well, thank you very much. Very nice to have a caller from Northern Ireland. A reminder that we are still a United Kingdom, so very pleased to welcome you on this morning. But Alex from Richmond, you want to make a point. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Rees-Mogg. I come up straight off with my position. I'm very anti-congestion charge, not because I don't think there's a problem, but they ought to come clean and call it what it is, which is a tax. You're a man of words. You would know that if you incur a charge, it's in return for something. And you don't get anything for your congestion charge. it's a tax, and I think the toxic tax will be just the same. We ought to come clean, and they ought to come clean, and call it what it is. It's a tax.
Well, I agree with you, and so does Tom from Staffordshire, who sent in a message earlier saying this tax will harm working people the most. The rich with pollution-prone cars will not be affected, they can afford it. Instead, ordinary folk will be forced effectively to fork out money they don't have to fund a state that disregards their interests. And you're broadly in agreement with Tom, aren't you?
Absolutely. I mean, you would agree if you incur a charge. Say, for example, you use the Severn Bridge. You save yourself a detour of about 50 miles.
Yes.
For paying the toll. And so on. Well, what do you get for paying the congestion tax?
And that toll's about to go anyway, so the Severn Bridge from later this year will be free.
Well, so should the Dartford crossing. It was paid for some years ago, but the charges were kept going.
And again, that then becomes a tax, doesn't it? Because it's already paid for, it's already made its money, and you're just charging people because you can.
I'd like to see a bit of honesty with our government. I know I'm hoping for something.
The triumph of hope over experience, as Dr. Johnson said, in relation to a man who's getting married for the second time. That's a rather different circumstance. Anyway, thank you so much for calling in. This is LBC. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, standing in for James O'Brien, and the time is 11:45, or quarter to midday, if you prefer it in the old way. Hello, good morning and welcome back. We've got lots of options for you. We're discussing the tea charge. We're going to continue with that for a bit longer. But then we're going to have a chat about Boris's speech earlier today, which was a really impressive and statesmanlike affair. And we're going to have some analysis of that. And then if we have time, we're going to talk about policemen painting their nails and see what people think of that. So lots to come up, but currently it's on the tea charge. And a gentleman's calling in from the Crystal Palace called Bill, who's spent some money on cars and is now worried they aren't worth anything. Bill, good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Rees-Mogg. Yes, within the last year I've spent about £31,000 on two vehicles. One is for my business and one for the other half. And trying to sell them, if I wanted to sell them again, we were offered, I just thought I'd put it through and see what someone would offer. And there's thousands and thousands of pounds knocked off the price because I, like others, were conned into buying a diesel vehicle thinking it was okay. And with the government saying what they're saying now, the diesel motors that people have bought aren't worth anything, really. Because no one wants to buy them.
No, it's appalling, isn't it, that the government encouraged people to do things and is now penalising them for having done it.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a lot of money to just throw away, isn't it? I mean, the van I wouldn't want to sell because it's part of my business. But we're now thinking about putting the car back in for, say, a part exchange.
Yes.
What we're being offered, and it was only like 8 months ago we paid £20,000 for it. We're being offered 11.
And are you now looking to get a petrol car instead?
Yes.
Yes.
What's it going to get in a diesel one?
Indeed, and there are long waits for petrol cars that a lot of the manufacturers don't seem to have many petrol cars on their stocks. I know this because I've had to replace my car because, as I was saying earlier, the hybrid system just gave up the ghost and at that point it wouldn't move. So I'm going for an ordinary petrol engine, which with a bit of luck will be reliable and will work for years. Thank you very much. I think you're in a very difficult position and it's long-standing policy difficulties that have created this. But now I'm joined by Theo Usherwood, the political editor at LBC, who's been paying very close attention to what Boris Johnson was saying this morning and is going to fill us in on his, I think, very important speech.
It was a very important speech, Jacob. He was taking the role of Foreign Secretary very seriously. Now, of course, there are some critics within the Conservative Party who have criticised Mr. Johnson for perhaps not necessarily playing the part that might be expected of a Foreign Secretary. But this morning he was speaking for Chatham House at St Pancras Station, a building that he helped reopen following the renovations. And the purpose of his speech was on North Korea and Iran and the benefits that nuclear weapons can provide the international communities such as the United States, France, the UK, and so forth. And he had this to say about the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un.
Kim Jong-un has tested 19 missiles so far this year and has conducted 4 of the 6 nuclear tests ever carried out by that country. It is now widely accepted that Kim is coming closer to being able to launch a nuclear-armed ICBM at the continental United States.
This was not a sabre-rattling speech. Boris was putting forward the benefits of strong international diplomacy, sticking up for President Donald Trump and the stance that he's taken against the North Korean leader.
But Kim Jong-un and the world need to understand that when the 45th President of the United States contemplates a regime led by a man who not only threatens to reduce New York to ashes, but who stands on the verge of acquiring the power to make good on his threat, I'm afraid that the US President, whoever he or she might be, will have an absolute duty to prepare any option to keep safe not only the American people, but all those who have sheltered under the American nuclear umbrella.
It wasn't a speech riddled with jokes, as his speeches normally are. It was very serious in tone.
Very serious in tone, and quite right to pick up on that, Jacob. This was not about playing to the gallery. This was not the Conservative Party conference where he is loved by everybody, who, most people at least, who turn up to that sort of event. This was about setting the tone, Britain's place in the world, and how we relate ourselves to the United States.
And it was focused on the nuclear risk. It was focused on Kim Jong-un and the treaty with Iran, where he was putting some pressure on the Americans to stick with the deal there.
Absolutely, you're quite right to pick up on that, because of course there has been pressure, particularly surrounding Iran, and whether the 2015 deal might suddenly lapse over, and then it might suddenly start acquiring or using the technology it already acquired to then turn those into nuclear weapons. Boris Johnson there sticking up for the tough line that had been taken previously, and the benefits that had in ensuring that Iran didn't attain nuclear weapons. He was also asked, and I should mention this very briefly because it pertains to everything that happened last week at the European Council in Brussels. He was asked about what his view was of the amount of money. EU leaders apparently demanding some talk of 48 billion euros, and this is what Boris had to say on that.
The offer that the Prime Minister made at Florence, and I remind you that the entire British cabinet is united around every dot, comma, syllable of the Florence speech. We think it's an excellent text. It's an excellent basis on which to proceed, and we hope our European friends and partners agree. I trust everybody has read, all you foreign policy junkies, you've all read the Florence speech, haven't you?
Not everyone here is from Europe, or Britain for that matter.
But they are nonetheless foreign policy junkies.
A slight light-hearted moment at the end of the question and answer session. Of course, Boris gave himself a little bit of wriggle room there when he said that the good offer made by the Prime Minister in Florence of around 20 billion euros, 18 billion pounds, and that, of course, how that relates to the 48 billion, substantially lower. Emmanuel Macron saying that he doesn't think it even goes halfway to covering the total bill that we'll end up paying. And of course that leaves open the door, and there's been talk today, hasn't there, that those talks will be in the Cabinet, at least, will be delayed until after Christmas.
That they won't be making a decision on how they're going to determine it. So there was a little bit on Brexit, but it was primarily a wider foreign policy speech, but including some quite interesting stuff on the relationship with Russia and the effort to try and get a better relationship with Russia. Did you read much into that?
Yes, it was interesting, and it also came up in the question and answer session where he was asked about Russia, and he said that relations weren't as good as they could have been with Moscow, and there'd been an effort, and there were going to be efforts to try and improve relations, because of course there's been he was asked about there was interference, whether, and the Prime Minister spokesman was asked today about comments made by the Labour MP for Exeter about Russian interference in the work that he'd been doing. Claims, I should stress, but he'd nevertheless said it in the House of Commons, so obtained privilege, that Russia had interfered in the Brexit in the referendum last June, and how that, of course, what the connotations, I guess, what the permutations are of that.
And a visit to Russia may be on the cards, that it was cancelled earlier in the year, but an attempt to reset, or is this going through the motions again?
I think there would be there could be an attempt to reset, but at the moment from my understanding, that things are fairly cool, shall I say, from that point of view.
And do you think the importance of this speech is in how it sets out the British government's foreign policy agenda, or is it important about how it resets people's expectations of Boris Johnson as a serious statesman, rather than as somebody who's very capable, very bright, but not serious?
I think it's more of the latter. If you look at the tone that Boris took, the way that the fact that he used Chatham House to deliver the speech rather than perhaps making it elsewhere or through another body, and the venue in St Pancras, it was an austere venue. He is trying to make himself appear the statesman. That will then give him, if it gives him the gravitas, that will then allow him to make forays into other areas without suddenly being accused of trying to undermine the Prime Minister. That will give him the more leverage, or that's the thinking at least, Jacob.
Well, Theo, thank you very much for reporting on that for us. I think it's a very important, potentially seminal speech from Boris, and I'm very much hoping that people will want to call in on that and say what they think, and they can call in on 0345 6060 973 or text on 84850 or tweet at LBC. And we're also going to try and discuss concerns with policing and all this stuff about them painting, I think it was their fingernails, but it may have been their toenails, but it seemed a very rum thing for the Rozzers to be doing when there are concerns about them not collecting enough evidence to put burglars away and attending to their normal business. So do please call in over the next hour. There's lots more to discuss. Thank you very much.